As a historian and a writer, there is literally nothing in the world that I could be doing that feels more important to me and that feels like I am better suited for. Like if you could have said to me, you can be anything in the world, what would it be? I would have said, well, I'd keep a diary of the country.
Hello, good evening, everyone. Welcome to Belmont Books. Welcome to all of you who are here in the store tonight, and also to the hundreds of people who are watching online thanks to our partnership with the GBH Forum Network. So, Heather Cox Richardson is a professor of history at Boston College. She's the author of several award-winning books focusing on the Civil War, the Reconstruction, and the American West. She has also written for many outlets such as the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Guardian, and in 2019, September of 2019, began a project called Letters from an American, where she writes a daily newsletter, which I think has changed the lives of probably many people in this room. Heather's ability to parse the politics we've all lived through in recent years and help us understand them in the context of larger historical forces has won her a huge and devoted following. As one person said, who may be here tonight, called the store about this event, she said, "Heather saved my life." So it's just not the thing you hear about historians very often. Anyway. Adam is a politics reporter for GBH. He is the host of Talking Politics. Prior to that, he worked for the Boston Phoenix, where he covered media and politics. He's a graduate of Carleton College in Minnesota and Harvard Divinity School down the road in Cambridge. Heather and Adam, we are so thrilled and honored to have you both here. Thank you so much.
I will speak for Adam to say how thrilled we are to be here. What Kathy didn't tell you is that I'm here and made a point of coming back to Boston for this tonight because she and I went to high school together about, 20 years ago? And I'm so thrilled about being here at this bookstore and being here with not only Kathy, but a number of our dorm mates are also here. So it's really going to be Old Home Week here. And Adam and I have worked together over the years as well. So it's nice to be sort of coming home to family again.
And as Heather pointed out when we were coming down the stairs, some of the interviews we've done have been really, really short, like on Greater Boston for WGBH, or GBH as we're supposed to call it now. 6 minutes, right? You know, you begin answering a question and I'm opening my mouth to ask someone else the next question or interrupt you.
All right, just so you know, they really do wear shorts under their suit jackets behind that desk. And I got in trouble once because I figured if they were wearing jeans or shorts, I could be doing the same thing. And I didn't realize that the people on the other side of the desk were on camera from the waist down. And I'm like, oh boy, I am so busted
One of
here.
the many inequities between host and guest. Yeah.
They look great from the waist up.
So I'd love to ask you at the outset, if you see this particular book as of a piece with your greater body of work, or if you see it as something fundamentally different than the work you've done before. I know that a lot of the themes are the same, but in terms of how you conceptualized it and how you executed it, is this a matter of continuity or of a radical departure?
So that's a great question, and I would suggest that this is very different than anything I've written before, although the content sometimes is very similar. And the reason for that is that this particular book was an offshoot of Letters from an American, and it was designed to be an explanation for all the questions that people ask me every day. How do the parties switch sides? What is the Southern strategy? What what is the Electoral College? And so I sat down to write the answers to the questions that people ask. And pretty quickly I realized that the one question everybody asks all the time is, how did we get here? What on earth is going on? And how do we get our country back? So the book from the beginning, although it's interesting because a number of reviewers have said they can't understand why I organized it the way I did, and I never once considered a different organization, because the first section of it is how did we get here? The middle section is where are we? And the third section is how we get out. And it was designed to be 30 very short chapters that you could read before bed. Because Ron Suskind told me before I wrote my last book that you wanted to make sure every section was short enough for people to read it before bed. And he said, you do that, you'll have a bestseller. And I was like, well, I'll give it a shot. And he was right? So, but quickly what happened with this book was, again, it was not intended to be a historical book that advanced a theory. It was really a series of essays. But what I discovered was that when I wrote the manuscript and put it aside for about 3 months and picked it back up, there was, in fact, a very different book there than the one that I had set out to write. And the book that was there was almost as if, in a classroom, if those of you who are teachers know that if you trust your students and you let them alone with the material, they often invent something that you did not foresee. Then you're part of it, but it's not you. And that book ended up being an exploration of how people vote to give up democracies, and why they vote to give up democracies, and the role of language and history in that. So it ended up being a deeply theoretical book, a historically theoretical book, but you don't have to read it on that level. All that being said, it felt like it was not mine, in a way that all my other books, I hold the reins. In this case, and this is such an example of the Letters from an American, I was doing the whole tightrope walk without the net, and trusting my readers. And when I did that, they wrote a book. So I wrote it, but it's not mine. And that's why it's dedicated to my readers.
You start off the how did we get here section by focusing on the New Deal and the backlash to the New Deal. Some people in the audience will know all about that. Some people will have read about it in the book or know about it from other sources. But for people who might need a refresher or might just want to hear your gloss on it, why is that the moment that you chose to start off the explanation of how we got here?
So my argument in the first section is that what we are seeing today is a backlash that has been going on since 1937 to try and get rid of the New Deal. And that New Deal government, begun by FDR and the Democrats and then built on by Eisenhower and what he called his middle way, is a government that regulates business, provides a basic social safety net, promotes infrastructure, and protects civil rights, especially civil rights in the states. And that government, when FDR first started putting that in place in 1933, the Republicans at the time thought it would never last. And then he gets reelected in 36. And when he gets reelected in 36, they kind of blow a gasket and figure they got to do something. And in 1937, a number of big business Republicans joined together with the racist Southern Democrats who don't like the fact that FDR is chipping away, and only chipping away, at racial segregation in the American South and the American West. And so they get together and they write this document called the Conservative Manifesto. And the manifesto goes nowhere, because what the manifesto does, I'll explain that in a second, but it gets leaked to the press. And when it gets leaked to the press, the Republicans run like little rabbits, because they're like, we'd rather fight FDR on our own. And the Democrats are like, hey, we're not going to criticize our president. But the manifesto gets spread across the country through chambers of commerce and newspapers and pro-business organizations. And what the Conservative Manifesto said was that there should be no regulation of business because it interfered with a man's property and the way he runs his business, and that would mess up the economic system. There should be no basic social safety net because that belonged to the churches. There should be no infrastructure spending by the federal government because that too should be done by individuals who could then pocket the money that they made from it. And certainly there should be no protection of civil rights. We needed to have what they called home rule. Doesn't that sound familiar? So I started with that moment because it was such a beautifully encapsulated little picture of where I think that trend has started and where it has taken us to. It's a little known moment. I mean, nobody really has ever written about it because it died so quickly. But boy, in that conservative manifesto, which I suspect L. Brent Bazell had in front of him when he wrote Arizona Senator Barry Goldwater's Conscience of a Conservative.
Oh, that makes sense, yeah.
Because it's the exact same points. I don't know that he had it in front of him, but they're the exact same points. And then, of course, Goldwater bled into Reagan, going forward.
One of the themes that runs throughout the book, you can tell me, maybe the most important theme, and I know it appears in other books of yours as well, is a tension between what you call the hierarchical and egalitarian strands of DNA in America. Can you elaborate more on how you see that relationship? And I'm especially interested, we were talking about this upstairs, I'm not sure if you see the hierarchical and egalitarian strands of our DNA as being equal in terms of heft and lasting power, or if you see one as more peripheral, marginal, but still dangerous. So,
at the end of the day, I think that for all the depth that we can get into on any number of stories about the way American society has developed, at the end of the day, it seems to me there's two ways to look at American society. And I won't do any country other than America, so maybe other countries could do the same thing. That's not what I'm trained in. There are people who believe that some people are better than others. And they're better than others either because of their money or their brains or their religion or their race or their ethnicity, where they came from. They think some people are better than others. And because those people are better than others, they have the right and maybe the duty to rule over everybody else. Now, logically, that position also suggests that at the end of the day, there'll be one guy who is, almost always a guy. Who's better than everybody else, and he really should be in charge of things. And that vision of the world stands in contrast to the idea that everybody is created equal and has a right to be treated equally before the law and has a right to have a say in their government. And those two strands, I think, run through American history. And one of the points that I was trying to make in this book was that people tend to look at where we are today and start screaming about fascism and start saying, we're in a fascist moment. And I'm one of those people who will sit here and nitpick about what fascism exactly was, but the argument that Mussolini was making in the 1920s about certain people being better than others, that became fascism, actually is that same theory. And one of the points I wanted to make was that when people think nowadays about fascism and that we must be in this fascist moment, I wanted to point out that when the Nazis were trying to come up with their legislation for making sure there were distinctions among races in Germany, where did they look? They looked to America and to the Jim Crow laws and the indigenous reservations. And so the idea that somehow we're in a modern moment where somebody invented this, I kind of wanted to say, certainly I'm no fan of Mussolini or Hitler, but I don't think we can walk away from the fact that those things run through our DNA as well.
One of the people you mentioned espousing that theory, I'm going to blank on his name, but a Confederate figure in the
James Henry Hammond.
He's the one who said, I refuse to accept that power is derived from the consent of the governed. Okay.
Well, no, there's two of them. I'm sorry, that's the other one. That's Fitzsimmons, right?
I'll take your word for it. I should have known. I should have written it down, and I didn't. But I mention that in part because when you're talking about the Civil War and talking about again, this tension between hierarchy and egalitarianism, you lament that there was an opportunity after the Civil War to, as you put it, root out the hierarchical strand in American politics and culture, and it wasn't done. And I'm wondering what, to your mind, that might have looked like. How could that have been done successfully if the hierarchical impulse is so deeply embedded in who we are?
So I love this question because let's think about what that might have looked like. In 1865, what are you going to do? The Confederacy has lost on the battlefield. And Grant, U.S. grant looks at the fact they've lost and looks at the fact it's spring and people are literally dying in the American South of starvation and says, surely, having rooted out the elite enslavers, everybody is going to want to join our system, which works so well. Look, the northern economy is absolutely booming. So one of the things we're not going to do is punish the former Confederates. Imagine what would have happened if, in fact, the former Confederates had had to pay a price for their attempt to destroy the United States of America, which is what they were trying to do. And it cost 600,000 lives and almost $6 billion. And nobody endured any consequences for those actions. So there was never a penalty for being a Confederate. There was never a reason to say, no, I didn't agree with that. And they began very quickly to change what they had meant when they had tried to destroy the United States. And within, 30 years, we've got statues to them. We've got statues to the people who were trying to destroy the country. And so just to start with what one could have done, I don't know, maybe like making somebody go to a courtroom would have been a start, right? Consequences matter, and nobody paid any consequences there. Now, I think once there's kind of a domino effect there. Once people start to pay the price for having embraced that ideology, then no longer is it a popular thing to do. No longer are you lionizing that. And if you don't believe me, take a look at China at the same time when the Taiping Rebellion was completely eradicated in just incredibly bloody ways. But you don't see people in China now running around saying we're going to bring back the Taiping Rebellion, right? I know that's a much more complicated story, but my point there is that people there paid a price. And had that been the case, had there not been this idea that, it was okay, that we actually weren't trying to protect enslavement, we were actually trying to protect small government, which is a construction of the period after 65, not before 65. The popular culture, I think, would have changed significantly. And we would not have seen what we see now with, the idea of cowboys being this great hero in that period and so on.
Which, if I recall correctly, you get into in how the South won the Civil War, right? That ideal migrates to the West.
Yeah, and west from Appomattox, too.
The fact that you just offered the analysis that you did, this isn't a question that we had previewed upstairs.
It's okay.
But it makes me wonder if you think that a lack of punishment and consequences was a huge part of why the arc of our history went the way it did after the Civil War. What have you found yourself making of the consequences or lack thereof post January 6th?
I was hoping you'd pick that up. So I do want to point out that one of the reasons that people in the United States didn't want there to be consequences after the war is they really thought that white Southerners would want to cooperate with the North again. And, one of the things that always bothers me is when we talk about that period and people say, well, as I just alluded to, well, nobody really paid any consequences for their participation in the Confederacy. But lots and lots and lots of people died during Reconstruction. It was just the allies of the United States. Black Americans died. Thousands of Black Americans died in the country after the Civil War. And that, basically the government said, we're not going to get these people, and they, in turn, are going to get those people. So we lost our allies in that. So I always like to point out that people really did die during Reconstruction. It was our allies instead of the people who were trying to destroy the country. So one of the reasons that I'm interested in the idea of people paying for their behavior is that I think it's important nowadays when we think about the attacks on the United States government around the time of the 2020 presidential election and what happened on January 6th, and frankly what's been happening since, it matters, I think, that more than 1,000 people have had consequences for their actions, and many people have gone to jail for long periods of time. And one of the things that you probably hear me break out in hives every time I see an article saying that for the good of the country, we should not move forward with legal cases against the lawyers and the politicians who were involved in that. And my answer to that is I believe that if we had Richard Nixon in court, he didn't even have to be convicted, but if we'd had Richard Nixon in court in 1975, we would not have had the Iran-Contra affair, we would not have had weapons of mass destruction, and Donald Trump would never have run for office, and we'd be in an extraordinarily different place. So I'm a big believer that that making our legal system paramount rather than sort of trying to give people political passes reinforces the idea of the rule of law and reinforces good behavior.
Speaking of Donald Trump, given your
Were we?
given your analytical framework, I'm wondering what your reaction is and what your explanation is for the fact that based on a pretty substantial body of polling at this point, it looks like in the next election, Trump is going to be the Republican nominee and has a very good chance of beating Joe Biden.
So that's a very complicated question, and I'm going to break it up in little pieces. First of all, I don't trust any polling right now, and I may not ever trust it because polling, one of the things that we're dealing with right now is the construction of a fake political reality, and that's actually a political position that a number of theorists are deliberately taking. That is, you can convince people to get rid of a democracy through their votes if you can convince them of something that is not true. It's called political technology or virtual politics, and it's theorized by Russian political theorists, although I have my suspicions about some American players in that as well. And there's a number of ways in which you do that. You convince people that that something is not real, and one of those ways is by flooding the zone with disinformation. And the polls, I think, you have to be very careful about who you follow. And if anybody cares, I can tell you who I follow. That being said,
Who do you follow, poll-wise?
Tom Bonnier, Bonier. He's great. He's just, because he doesn't just look at the polls. He looks at the polls and then he says, now let's look at the demographics of that district and see what the difference is between the two. So he's fabulous. But that being said, yeah, Donald Trump is running really strongly. And I think that has a number, that there are a bunch of things going on. I am not worried. In a free and fair vote in this country, I am not at all worried about Donald Trump and Trumpism. I think in a free and fair vote, the Democrats would have the House, the Senate, and the presidency for a long time. However, one of the things that's happened, at least since 2010 and before that, since 2010, we've had extraordinary gerrymandering. And if you look at the fact that the Republicans hold a 4-seat majority in the House of Representatives right now, and the districting in Ohio, Alabama, Florida, and Alabama has all been found to be unconstitutional, it's entirely likely we should have had a Democratic House of Representatives as well. That has gotten worse since 2022, not better. And we've also had voter suppression in a really big way since 1986, although it really has taken off more recently. And in fact, one of the things that I'll be writing about tonight is the fact that in Ohio, where all the polls tell you that protecting reproductive health care is very, very popular. Oopsie poopsie, they lost 26,000 people off the rolls in critical districts. Same thing happened in Virginia. And this has been going on now since 1998 in a majority, in a major way. That was in Florida, where more than 100,000 people were kicked off the rolls right before the election of 2000, 1998, 2000. And that election was important in Florida, as I recall. So that worries me a lot. Now, the third piece of that, of course, is the degree to which the right-wing media has created a false reality that reinforces the culture wars that are driving so many people in certain areas.
When it comes to election integrity, do you fault the Democrats at all for not pushing more aggressively when they had a chance to make some big substantive changes?
In retrospect, 100%. That being said, there's this wonderful interview that Steve Roger Stone, not Steve Bannon, Roger Stone did with a reporter in Florida. He did a number of interviews with her. Sometimes you can find them on the Wayback Machine, but a lot of them have disappeared. And he talks about the 2020 election in Florida, which you may remember there was the Brooks Brothers riot in which he claimed to be a major player. He probably was not a major player. He was definitely there. And he said, we just love that because the Democrats and Gore thought it was all about protecting the Constitution, and we knew it was a street fight. And what's interesting about that is, that's not a direct quote, but that's basically what he said. But what's interesting about that is, who saw what was happening and were ballistic over the fact that Democrats backed down? Black Americans. Black Americans saw exactly what was happening, and they were like, you have to fight this in the trenches. And the Democrats, of course, were busy protecting the Constitution.
I'm wondering if there are any other ways in which you think that Democrats or people on the left, broadly speaking, bear some measure of responsibility for the dire situation that we currently find ourselves in. And one thing that occurred to me when I was starting to ask that question is, I remember being a little frustrated at watching Biden on the campaign trail in the last election, and he seemed to have this operating theory that if you just get Donald Trump out of the White House, then it's like everyone's going to wake up from a fever dream and say, wow, what the hell was that? And then we would get back to business as usual, which we haven't done. So that's just one possible example.
In fairness, though, who thought that they were going to keep the big lie going? I mean, remember I said I was going to stop writing the letters 100 days into the Biden administration? Because who does that? Except these people do that. So Biden was doing interesting things in that election, actually. And just to speak to that, one of the things that I don't think people are seeing, and certainly is not showing up in the polls, are the number of people who are pro-Biden and pro-Democrats and not visible. So there are a number of organizations that just don't make the mainstream papers. Nobody knows about them. But right before the election, I was on a call, and I was on a call with a whole bunch of people who pledged to bring 10 people to the polls, make sure 10 people voted. And there were 22,000 people on that call. And the next day on Twitter, some guy was saying, oh my God, I was in a call last time. We had 4,000 people on that call. And somebody who'd been on the same call as I was said, well, I was on a call last night with 22,000 people. And the guy retorted, pictures or it didn't happen. And I was like, well, I was there too. I mean, I didn't have a picture, but this is really going on. And that was your red wave that didn't happen. And similarly, the 8-point difference in every special election that's had reproductive rights on the ballot since the overturning of Roe v. Wade by Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health last June, in June 2022. That's 8 points. 8 points the Democrats overperformed by. So I think a lot of that is going on as well. Now, that being said, though, I think one of the things that people, I'm going to call them Democrats, that liberals have been not smart about since the 1970s has been the expectation that the Supreme Court and the president would protect civil rights. That, so long as you got the right president in there, everything else was going to be okay. And the degree to which people who care about progressive causes have let local elections and state elections slide is hugely problematic. And if you don't believe me, remember that the current Speaker of the House of Representatives, Mike Johnson from Shreveport, Louisiana, has never faced an opponent. And he is now the Speaker of the House of Representatives. And they spent the day, voting to gut, the EPA. And of course, it's not going to go anywhere, but, had he ever faced any opponent, he might not be where he is today. So I think that's been a real problem. I think it's a problem that same group I just talked about is challenging. They're running for school boards. They're running for local elections. They're running for state elections now. But it's going to take at least 2 cycles for that really to bubble up.
I want to just go back briefly to something you said about the creation of a virtual or false political reality as a way of convincing people to cede their rights via the vote. You talked about Fox News or you referenced Fox News and their impressive ability to gin up outrage over various culture war issues. I always wonder when I hear people talking about Fox generating outrage there. On the one hand, they're very good at it, but is it also possible that there are, in fact, a large number of Americans, a larger number than maybe most people in this room might want to think, who actually come in sympathetic to where Fox is going on stuff like, for example, transgender rights or DEI issues, and that is one reason that perhaps what I'm trying to say is that it's not as virtual or fake a reality as some people might want to think.
Okay, so I'm going to throw this back to you because you are in the media.
I am.
I mean, what we're doing is talking about the relationship between media and ideology. And any political scientist will tell you there's between 20% and 30% of people who will grab hold of a reactionary movement and they will not let it go. So when people say, what do I do about grandpa and the way he feels about, immigrants.
Black Lives Matter.
Yeah,
Okay.
Black Lives Matter. The answer is feed him a cookie because nothing's going to happen and it's not worth having that conversation, right? But the other 70 to 80%, how they leap has a lot to do with the world in which, the water in which they swim. And the degree to which language and the presentation of issues has been manipulated by people on the right since, I would say the 1950s, actually, and certainly since Nixon's administration, which did it very deliberately. The idea of sending Spiro Agnew, Nixon's vice president, out to engage in what they called positive polarization. That is, convince people not to agree, but rather to be separated so that you could gin up fury on your side so people would turn out to vote. That was a deliberate strategy. The degree to which they have done that has given us a world in which many people think that they are reacting to something they really believe in because they have not had the other side. And one of the things that's really been interesting about watching the book banning programs in the local school districts and the idea of taking of determining what students can read in schools is that, remember that went through the country like wildfire. Was it last summer? I can't even remember.
It's going through Massachusetts too.
Okay, so the people who are fighting that literally train people to go and say, no, we want parental control. That is, we don't want those strangers coming in and telling us how to think about what our children can read. We want parents in this community who support our teachers to have control of that, and they're winning all the school boards back in heavily Republican districts. So part of it is just how you tell the story.
I was reading a transcript of another interview you did. This was with Magnet Chakrabarty from WBUR, in which you mentioned that you have, on occasion, been accused of being a shill for Republicans. And when I saw that, I thought, what the hell is she talking about? Because it doesn't square with what I know of you and your work. Who has made that accusation, and why have they made it?
So I love this. I'm either accused of being a shill for Republicans or as a shill for Democrats, and I always say I'm a shill for democracy. So when I started doing what I do, the act of studying politics and government, by definition, seemed to many people to indicate that you were on the right. When I talked about the founding documents and all those things. And I had to laugh because early on, there was, not even that early on actually in my career, there was a great deal of complaint about that. And I continued to talk about the same things in the exact same way. And within 20 years, I was suddenly a shill for the left. And I was like, here's a news flash. The Declaration of Independence has not changed, and I really haven't changed the way I'm talking about it. But there was a period when if you talked about the Declaration and the Constitution and federalism and all those things, people thought you were on the right.
Do you think, you say there was a period like that. Are we in a similar period right now to an extent? Because just to get back to my question about whether the left has done certain things that might have helped shape the reality we're in right now, it seems to me like there may be a fairly large portion of left-leaning American Democrats who see the documents that you just talked about, or federalism, as fundamentally flawed and maybe irredeemable, given the realities of the time in which they were crafted and the fact that so many of the men who crafted them owned enslaved people, didn't want to grant the franchise to a, had a hierarchical view of society. Is that an attitude that you think is still prevalent on the left?
So this is a great question, and one of the distinctions I really like to make is that I believe, but I don't have to believe it myself, because we know that the vast majority of Americans are in the center. That is, like, more than 80% of us agree that we want common sense gun safety legislation. Huge numbers of people want reproductive rights. We want investment in the economy. We want, basically many of us are what people like me would describe as liberals. That is, people who believe in the system the way it is set up. We don't necessarily believe in who's running it now, but we believe in the system the way it's set up, and we believe that those institutions, which are never perfect, but that they are an institutional structure that can accomplish those things, and they can be changed to do that. People on the right, literally politically considered on the right, not part of that, right-leaning center, but on the right, want to tear that system down because they don't believe that it ultimately answers the needs of our society. And nowadays, they want to replace it with Christian nationalism, with a strong government that will, in fact, force the rest of us to adhere to their Christian beliefs. People on the left also disagree with the fundamental system. They would like to tear that system down. But there's two distinctions that I think are really important right now. The first is that those people on the left who want to tear the system down, there aren't that many of them, and they're not in positions of power. There never has been a strong left-wing movement in America that wanted to destroy those institutions, with the possible exception of a period in the early 20th century. And I'm just going to do a plug here for Michael Willrich's new book called American Anarchy, I think. I'd never understood anarchism as well as he explained it in that book. I think it's out this month. I loved it. I think I blurbed it. Anyway, but they're not in huge positions of power. And crucially, and this is the point I always make when people want to tear down our systems, tell me what's better. Like, I'm 100% on board. If you can say to me that you have a system that's going to work better and you can show me how it works better, man, I am totally on board, because I'm not going to disagree with you about systemic racism or the framers or any of those things. But it terrifies me when I hear both people on the far right and on the far left talking about getting rid of our Constitution, having a new constitutional convention, or tearing them down. And it terrifies me because when I look at the destruction of liberal institutions, of liberal democracy, which has happened around the world, I have never seen it replaced by anything other than authoritarianism. And I do not see how, as pissed off as you might be at our system, that you think it's going to be better when you hand it over to a few rich guys who get to do whatever they want. And again, I'm perfectly happy to be convinced, but so far I'm not seeing it.
This is, I think, going to mark a shift into the audience question portion of the evening. It's also something I had wanted to ask you about. People were curious, a few audience members were curious about a criticism that Adam Gopnik made in the New Yorker of your take here. And I think I can paraphrase it accurately. I hope I can paraphrase it accurately. Essentially, in my reading, he felt that there were no conservative voices, conservative thinkers, conservative movements that you were engaging with in a generous way as possible sources of wisdom about the past, present, or future. Basically, he thought you didn't give anyone right of center credit for operating in good faith or having good ideas. What do you make of that critique?
So I have not read that review and probably won't. Not because, I mean, I actually quite like Gopnik's work, but I feel like it's not necessarily a good thing to read reviews of something that you can no longer change, right? You just got to keep on moving forward. So this book was designed to do something very specific. It is not an engagement with the different theories of liberalism and conservatism in American society. It's just not. It's a picture of how we got here, how where we are and how we get out. So I don't think it's unfair to say that one certainly can find and should find useful conservative voices. I don't think they're the ones who have, in this moment, determined the direction of this country. And one of the things that really jumps out to me is when I wrote my history of the Republican Party, which came out in 2014, there was a cry at the end of it to beg the Republicans to regain their past, to go back to the traditional views they had, and to highlight some of those more traditional conservatives. And the book was excoriated on the right. They hated this book, and how could I ever say such things? The party was never going to go down the road that I said it was going to go down. And I was actually looking at that, and many people wanted me to write rebuttals, and then they wanted to have fights and all that, and I was like, no, I'm moving on. And I thought about that. I was looking at one of them the other day, and I thought, they owe me an apology. The only thing is I should have been harsher. So there are certainly plenty of conservative thinkers who bring a lot to the table, and I would like to see them taken seriously again in our country, because I think you do have to have a dialectic. I will say I think the people at the Bulwark are doing a phenomenal job. If you don't read the Bulwark, you should. There are a number of conservative voices that are great, but they are not the ones that are determining where our politics are today.
Bit of a different question from an audience member. How does Heather do this every day?
Well, I'm a little bit laughing because my college roommate is back there. I used to live with her when I started these, and so she has watched me do this. And, how can I not? I've done it every night for more than 4 years. So how do you stop? It's kind of like a soap opera. Or like exercise. If you're a runner, you can't take a day off. And if you're watching a soap opera, you can't miss a day because something's going to happen. And so the harder thing for me nowadays is figuring out what to write when so much is happening. So there are two completely separate letters that need to be written tonight. And sometimes I fudge it and say, meanwhile, but if you've noticed, I have in the last several months been grouping things, because otherwise it just becomes scattershot. And I feel like if there's a story, you get it better, and you just can't do every. And there's also the problem. Somebody was furious with me when I didn't write about a major mass shooting. And I made the point as a writer that you can't have two major points in the same piece because they cancel each other out. So if there is something really big that I need to cover and something else big happens, often I will punt one of them off to a later day so it gets more attention. So it's not exactly that this happened, this happened, this happened. It was early on and is much more, I'm trying to catch trends now.
On the heels of you mentioning someone was upset with you for not talking about a mass shooting when it occurred, that made me wonder, is it ever draining or exhausting or burdensome to feel like there's this massive audience of people who are expecting you on a daily basis to address everything that happened that day that they find important, significant, triumphant, outrageous, despicable? What does that feel like on a personal level?
So, yeah, it is a huge amount of pressure. Not that. The pressure is the many, many people who write to me and say, I can't sleep until I read you. But no pressure, right? But you know what I do? I don't write. Every night I say, I'm not going to write tonight. And then I say, well, I'll just write a little. But I'm only going to write 500 words tonight. Well, except for that story. And then, it clocks in almost the same length every night. I think because now I write in that sense. But what you're talking about, I think, is what I would call hate mail. And I get that every day, at least 2 or 3 strongly worded pieces that come to me personally, as opposed to the Substack email, which I don't read. I can't handle just the pressure of that. And they sometimes they make me mad. But more than that, I think I wish people had more charity, because it's not easy to do it. And I do very rarely make mistakes. But sometimes, it's 4 o'clock in the morning and I choose the wrong word. And I'm perfectly willing to say it was 4 o'clock in the morning and I chose the wrong word. And I will never forget, somebody said, "I just don't believe you." And I have to, and I didn't write back, but my response was a 4-letter word with a 3-letter word following it. So that being said, there is something else, though, about the letters, and that is that as a historian and a writer, there is literally nothing in the world that I could be doing that feels more important to me and that feels like I am better suited for. Like, if you could have said to me, you can be anything in the world, what would it be? I would have said, well, I'd keep a diary of the country. And I get to do that. I get to do that every freaking night. And I feel like I am the luckiest woman in the world. Even though, yes, I fall asleep on my desk all the time. And yes, I'm exhausted. And yes, I don't know when the last time was that I actually ended up going to bed before midnight, unless I was so tired because I just fell over on the couch. But I got to keep the record of this period. And I never forget that I get to do it because you all read it. And so every night I think of my college roommates first, to whom I write, and then my audience who's out there asking questions and arguing and telling me they don't believe me that I got the wrong word or whatever. And that's why it feels so collaborative and why I feel like it's such an important project that we're all of us engaged in.
All right, here's a deep philosophical audience question. Are current political events new and different, or just a repeat of numerous political events of the past with new players?
Well, you've heard it a million times. The past doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes, right? So what historians do is we study how and why societies change. And people try and look in the United States. There's actually some differences in history according to what continents you're studying and what countries you're studying. But in the United States, we look at events. We try and look at have documents, have proof that something happened, and from that to draw theories about how the world works, how things change. I look at stuff and I say ideas. It's ideas that change the world. So I'm always trying to find out what ideas are going on. Other people are like, who cares about ideas? It's all about money. Other people are like, no, it's not about money. It's about religion. And all of those things are legitimate. You don't have to agree with me or with somebody else. And you can put a bunch of those things together because everybody's perspective is different. But if you are looking for those things, the theories behind why things happen, it's very easy to see patterns. So they're patterns that are enacted by a new set of people. But, again, one of the things that I will write about tonight is the oopsie poopsie, we lost 26,000 voters off the rolls in Ohio. What does that say but 1868 in the American South? I mean, literally, I having said that, I could say to you, go to Google right now, and you all could find the exact places that happened. So it is the patterns, I think, of human society because people are just people.
For better or worse, I guess. Not always uplifting. Another question. Appreciate the insight and continued learnings. How can the audience proactively have an impact on our democracy?
So I'm gonna tell you my version of that, having just talked about ideas. I believe that societies change when ideas change. So you talk. You write letters to the editor. You go to the school board meetings. You go to town hall. You speak to your neighbors. You talk. You say, no, I don't believe that's really happening. Have you seen this? That doesn't necessarily mean starting fights. It just means changing the conversation, changing the way people talk. That being said, certainly in this next year coming up here, run for office, support people running for office, work at elections, give to candidates you care about. But here's the big thing that's happening around the world, around the country right now, and that is something that has a fancy title if you need it. It's called relational organizing. And that is make sure that your friends are showing up to vote. You think all your friends are showing up to vote, and they're maybe going to the grocery store and forgetting that day. Make sure your friends in crucial states are showing up to vote, because it really, really matters this time around. And there's a number of places where you can work with people, and of course right now I'm totally blanking on the name, where you can work with organizations that will let you know whether or not your friends have voted, and you can text them and call them and say you need to show up at the polls, and you should start this week, because what's happening in Ohio and Virginia is incredibly important. Pennsylvania as well. It's important everywhere, but in Virginia, Pennsylvania, and Ohio, these are really crucial votes. And it's all going to come down to turnout, especially when they're losing people off the rolls.
Another query, and you get to play media critic again here. Any suggestions on how to get the media to cover the great job President Biden is doing?
I don't know. I think we should ask the media guy here, don't you?
Wow. I didn't sign up for this. I can't. I feel like, in defense of my media brethren, I tend to cover local politics, not national politics. I feel like I have seen a fairly large amount of attention paid to some of the stuff that you get into in the book when you're talking about Biden's legacy, about how ambitious and how effective he has been when it comes to creating new social programs. I've also seen plenty of coverage of him losing his train of thought, of him, looking old, looking like, people pointing out that he doesn't quite have it the way he used to. It's tough for me to offer any suggestion for how to get rid of the latter type of thing when it comes to political coverage, because honestly, I think it's to some extent ingrained in the way those of us who cover politics in one way, shape, or form do our job. There's a mix of substantive and stylistic, and sometimes we go with the stylistic excessively.
Do you think it is partly that there's so much else going on? That one of the things that really jumped out to me in the last 2 weeks is the administration has been just doing stuff right and left. Mm-hmm. And where's it going to get any oxygen?
It could, yeah. I mean, if you've got ongoing war in Ukraine, Israel and Hamas, when was our this
Trump's,
will sound horrible.
Legal cases,
Trump's
and his
legal
melting
cases,
down, and
the latest mass shooting, whatever it is, whenever there just was one, there will be another. You may be right about that. Yeah, I can't give a good answer. I can't. I'm not sure if the person who asked the question is out there, and if you are, or if you sympathize with her or him, I'm sorry that I'm not giving a better answer. I don't know how you do it.
So one of the things that jumps out to me when I go through the news every night is the stories are there. Because remember, I'm not an investigative journalist. I'm finding stories in places that are publicly available. and that's a little bit frustrating. So the reporters for the Defense Department and for the State Department are fabulous. They're really good reporters, and you can read the news, the press. There's a daily press conference. You can read it every day, and you can find out what's happening with the State Department or with the Defense Department, and certainly with the White House, where I have to say I think the state and the defense people are better journalists than the White House journals corps in general, but those stories are out there, and many of them are actually in legacy media or in very popular media, but there's so much around them. You have to know what to look for to see whether or not it's important. And it's kind of like watching a soap opera. You've got to know the stories. So this whole thing, this executive order on artificial intelligence, that was huge, but unless you kind of knew it was there and knew why it was a big deal, you didn't get it. And similarly, the fact that did you even see the fact that the Biden administration has sued Amazon? Like, that's been coming for a long time, and that's a really big deal. It's like the crown jewel of antitrust action for decades, right? But it was just one more thing that day when there's so much else that is so easy to cover. I mean, every time the former president gets out in front of Truth Social, you could write a whole paper just on that. So I wonder if that's part of it, but they're definitely, and I do think there's been a change where people are starting to pay more attention to the longer stories, but it's an issue.
And I do think, I remember hosting a show where we had a conversation about this fairly recently. I do think there's some awareness on the media's part that, it's taken a long time to develop, but that there's growing awareness that we don't need to stop the presses and shift our attention every time former President Trump says or does something outrageous. Like, it's not, we did it all through the last cycle. We kept on doing it. I think there's understandable reasons to have the impulse to do it, but you don't need to do it.
Well, but at the same time, one of the things that made me bonkers recently was how little press, relatively, he got for saying that the then Joint Chiefs of Staff, the chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, should. I'm going to be careful about how I say it, because he didn't say he should be executed, but man, he came right up to the line.
Which he's so good at doing, right?
Yeah. And that's headline news for years.
And that's always the tricky balance to strike, right? Do you become, on the one hand, how do you avoid giving excessive oxygen while not simply becoming inured to the outrageous and dangerous ideas that he will put forward?
Well, I like the idea of not the race but the stakes. The idea that rather than sort of saying, this person's going ahead, now this person's going ahead, you talk about what those people would do for democracy, and what it would, what the overall picture is. So again, one of the things that jumped out today was Zinke, who was Trump's Secretary of the Interior, saying that he wanted to stop all Palestinians from coming into the United States and revoke all their green cards and say that you could no longer come from the Palestinian territories to the United States. And that, of course, is big right now because of what's happening in the Middle East, but the larger picture of that ties right into Trump's Muslim ban, his travel ban, which bigger picture ties right into the whole idea of people like Viktor Orban and of Hungary and Vladimir Putin of Russia, that immigration will ruin a country. So, here is Trump saying we're essentially, or Zinke, who's going to be a Trump guy, saying essentially we're going to keep Muslims out of the United States. I wonder how much press that's going to get tonight, because it sounds a little complicated, right? Zinke, who's he?
Yeah, who's
aside
that
from
guy
the
again?
corrupt guy who bought that really expensive door.
This might be the last question, because I just got a 5-minute note, and that was a couple minutes ago. Another audience question: how can we regain the Republican Party from control of the radical right wing so that we have a functioning Congress?
So This is an absolutely fascinating and an important question. And, I just did 2 nights ago, I did a thing with Tom Nichols about the Republican Party. And this week as well, I talked to Michael Steele, who used to be the chair of the Republican Party. And the party itself, in its current form, for many, 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 many years, I kept saying that, everyone would say the Republican Party is dead. And I would say, no, it's not. The Republican Party goes through these things. It always does. It starts as an egalitarian party, and then it becomes a really big business party, and it screws everybody, hurts everybody, and then it goes back the other way around. And then it becomes an egalitarian party again. It's about to become an egalitarian party again. And I said that for way too long. And I think it was about a month ago I said, that's it. It's dead. And this current Republican Party is irretrievable. And it is now a Christian nationalist, white supremacist, radical, extremist group trying to destroy our democracy. And once your party has become an undemocratic party in a democracy, you're done. That being said, the ideology behind the original Republican Party, the idea that the government should respond to ordinary Americans, making them equal before the law and giving them access to resources, including education, because that is the way you you support a strong strong economy to support a society. That idea. And the idea that then supports the next level up, and that supports a top level, which in turn hires people at the bottom. That idea is as much a part of our DNA as the democratic ideology, which started in a different period and says something very different. And it is my firm belief that the Republican Party's ideology will be reborn in another organization that may or may not call itself Republican. It was interesting to me, I saw just last week, I think maybe 2 weeks ago, a Republican talked about creating a new party called the Constitutional Conservatives. It's the first time I've seen a Republican call for a new party. And I think that will be reborn. And one of the groups I'm watching to see how they jump is the newly elected Republicans from New York, who are trying to get Santos thrown out of Congress. And they're trying to get Santos thrown out of Congress because they don't want to be tied to him. And if you are a young Republican, you don't want to be tied to these jokers. Demographically it's a non-starter. So I'm kind of watching them to see what happens.
Heather, I'm thrilled I got to have this convo with you.
Thank you so much.